COVID-19 has reshaped globalization and further strained Sino-American relations. How will this influence China's role in the Middle East and the wider Mediterranean region? The ChinaMed Tel Aviv University China in the Mid-Med series looks at this dynamic in conversation with leading global voices. Look at the world of tomorrow. Join the China in the Mid-Med series.
Welcome to the series of in-depth interviews and discussions by the China and the Middle East Mediterranean Project. I am Dr. Orisella, Chair of the Department of East Asian Studies at Tel Aviv University, and with me as hosts are my colleagues Dr. Brendan Friedman of the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, and Professor Enrico Fardella, the Director of the ChinaMed Research Network, and also the Director and Founder of Peking University's Center for Mediterranean Area Studies. This is the third year of our collaboration, following a conference held at Tel Aviv University 2 years ago, and then the first edition of our joint project last year. Now we focus on COVID-19 and related connectivity, security, and energy challenges. We are very honored to have with us today Ambassador Efraim Halevy. Brendan?
Efraim, Boker Tov, good morning. It's a privilege to have you with us today. Thank you for your time. Before we get started, I wanted to briefly introduce you for the benefit of our viewers. Ambassador Halevy was the director of the Mossad, Israel's Foreign Intelligence Services, from 1998 to 2002, serving under three different premiers. His career in the Mossad spanned 4 decades. He was also the head of the National Security Council in 2002 until mid-2003. And he was also the ambassador to the European Union between 1996 and 1998. Ambassador Halevy has a long and distinguished career of service here in Israel, and we are lucky to have him with us today. Efraim, thank you again for your time.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I thought we would begin today with sort of the big picture on China. Yesterday, the Financial Times ran a feature story titled "U.S. and China Edging Towards a New Kind of Cold War, a New Type of Cold War." You have a long experience with the Cold War, the first and the one that spanned the 20th century. And so I wanted to ask you how you saw that kind of comparison, which we're increasingly seeing in the international media. And if you could give us a little bit of your sense of the changing nature of the relationship between the US and China.
I think the comparison between the two events you have mentioned, the event of the Cold War and the event of the Chinese-American relationship today, is an unfortunate and I think not irresponsible, but it looks a kind of an escape mechanism of avoiding the speciality of the present situation. The Cold War was a war which was between two different philosophies of life. It was a war which was traditional in terms of the relationship between the so-called free world and Russia, and the Soviet Union, which was the partner of the Cold War, was a unique creation of the Comintern, of the International Communist Party creed and organization. And today we have a different situation. The Soviet Union is no longer existing. We have Russia, which is a very large power, but it's not the Soviet Union. I'm sure President Putin would like to, how should I say, revive the Union in a different form and lead what was then the Soviet Union, but he doesn't have the capability today. He didn't have it before the COVID-19, and he certainly doesn't have it now in the midst of a crisis in Russia these very days. I think the relationship with the question whether China and the United States are going to slide into a prolonged confrontation is too early to judge. What I do think is that both sides, both China and the United States, have too many interests to avoid reaching that point in the history of the two major powers of the world today. I think China has achieved much over the world in the last 40, 50 years, especially after the demise of Mao Zedong, after the change in the way that China has opened up to the world, and China becoming a power which operates on all 5 continents in an ever-growing capacity. I think that is a China which would not like to revert to the past. And as far as the United States is concerned, we have a very unique presidency today. We'll know in a few months whether there'll be a second term. If it's not a second term, then possibly the term of Trump will be an aberration of 4 years, which will pass. If there is a second term, then there is, of course, an element of consistency here, which has to be taken into account. I don't think that President Trump today has a real appetite for upping the ante with the Chinese beyond what is controllable. And he has the character of chopping and changing when he wishes, both in his public statements and also in his policies. I think that President Trump, viewing the situation inside the United States and the fact that the United States is the country with the largest challenge of COVID-19 we have today, the number of sick and the number of fatalities are growing daily, not exponentially, but growing daily. And I don't think that President Trump, when he is with himself at night watching TV, which he does every night, if he really wants to enter into a full-blown confrontation with China, I believe not. On the other side, I think China also has a problem. It has a problem because something went wrong in China concerning this COVID-19. Whether they were able to stem it at the outset is still a matter of conjecture. The story of what really happened in Wuhan is a story which has not become public knowledge even to this day. The Chinese are not cooperating. There is no transparency of any kind between the Chinese and the world concerning this particular issue. And in the last few days, there has been a recurrence of sickness in the Wuhan area, which they have made public. And I think, therefore, it's too early to say how this relationship between China and the United States is going to evolve. And I think that we would do well not to pass judgment on that and to be patient with our rush to reach conclusions. It's too early to reach conclusions on major changes of the kind we're talking of. I also think that as a result of what has happened, both China and the United States, due to the medical challenges that both are facing, would be very hesitant in going to war at this stage. The armed forces, probably of both sides, have also suffered. We know of what has happened in the United States. We know of the now famous story of the American captain of a ship, who has been removed from office, and now there is a major debate whether he should be reinstated. This is not the time to go to war, either for China or for the United States.
Thank you. Your answer raises the issue. Former U.S. official Thomas Finger described the U.S.-China relationship as fractious but not fragile. And so, given the changing nature of that relationship, do you see the politics in the Middle East being affected by U.S.-China dynamics? And if so, in what ways?
I think, first of all, let us note that all the countries in the Middle East, all the players in the Middle East, have been very careful not to enter that area of the present Chinese-American confrontation. In Israel, there has been an understanding. I think this is common knowledge that we have had our differences with China, and we're going to talk about them later. But there's a common understanding in Israel that Israel would be well served by not entering that field of confrontation. As you have seen, Israel has not even allied itself with the United States on many of the issues. It has been less than critical of the United States in the way the American administration has handled the challenge in the United States. And it is certainly not going to pass judgment on China. We have other problems with China, and we don't have to add on that. I also think this is true for other countries in the Middle East. I've not seen any eagerness on the part of Saudi Arabia to enter this field. I've not seen Iran entering this field. I think Iran now is entering a very interesting period in its relationship internationally. This morning, there is a report that the Iranians are eager to open up negotiations with the United States on prisoner exchange. This is something which could be very interesting. There's quite a number of people on both sides who have been arrested and who are in prison. And my guess is that President Trump would not rush to reject this offer, although to forecast what Trump is going to say 24 hours after the event is a very hazardous attempt on my part. But I think that it might well be that Trump will see the advantages of letting a negotiation of this kind proceed, since this might also be an achievement that he will be able to wave in the election campaign, that he's obtained the release of Americans who have been imprisoned in Iran for quite some time. So I think all in all, the question whether the Chinese-American confrontation will be affecting the Middle East at the moment, I think the immediate answer is no. Although the Chinese have been very, very active in the Middle East the last few years, we'll talk about that as well. But I don't see the Chinese and the Americans immediately going for a confrontation in the Middle East at this particular point in time, depending on how the illness develops, how COVID-19 develops in the months to come, whether the United States will be able to ultimately to get control of what is happening on the medical battlefield in the United States. That will be one situation. If things get worse and the Americans fail to control what is happening in the United States, this will have far-reaching consequences in many fields, including the Chinese-American confrontation, including the Middle East.
Let me jump in on that. So this is in terms of confrontation, but on the other hand, there's been voices in Israel, not just in Israel, in the past, let's say, almost a decade, I would say, perhaps more, that China's involvement in the region can, or potentially can, bring the various sides in the region, Israel and its neighbors, into a sort of a new type of negotiation. Do you see any such potential looming in the near future or even further down the road?
You're referring to the Israeli conflict with the Palestinians?
Yes, mainly.
The Israeli conflict with the Palestinians is going through a very interesting time at the moment due to the Corona challenge. let us remember that the Corona challenge is a challenge with our neighbors, our immediate neighbors. Some will say it's a challenge in which the Palestinians are inside the belly of Israel because of Jerusalem and elsewhere. And we've seen a mode of cooperation we haven't seen for many, many years. We've seen effects of joint cooperation in the medical field. Today, there was an announcement Israel is going to pass a large sum of money to the Palestinian Authority. I think it's 8 million shekels or something, to be able to deal with the financial problems in the Palestinian camp. And on the southern side, we have a degree of cooperation between Israel and the Hamas authorities, which has never been seen before. On the medical side, we've seen Israeli aid to the Gaza Strip. We have seen people from Gaza, medical officials and medical staff coming inside Israel, into the heart of Israel at the Sheba Hospital, and receiving training there in order to be able to be more effective back home. All this is setting the scene, as you know, for a negotiation between Israel and the Hamas on a possible exchange of prisoners. Some say it's far off, some say it's near. There's a lot of misinformation on this, intentional misinformation, I think, in order to prevent the leakage of very, very delicate positions which are taken on both sides. We're on the eve of forming a national government in Israel, and the last thing that the current Prime Minister, who will be the future Prime Minister, needs is that this issue will suddenly break out and become an internal political matter of debate and of disagreement. So I think that we have to say that also here in the region, the general conditions for a possibility of meaningful negotiations between us and the Palestinians is on the table. But, and there's a big but, the big but is the immediate issue of annexation of the settlements in the West Bank. This is something which the United States has permitted Israel to proceed with on the basis of the Trump plan for solving the Palestinian problem. And there is talk of a major step in July, I believe, when the time will be set and the date will be set for an immediate annexation of all the settlements, including the so-called illegal settlements, or not so-called, depending on your political views, but all the settlements, to annex them to Israel. Practically doesn't mean very much, but it has a lot of symbolic significance. So we have here conflicting, shall we say, channels of progress. We have channels which are not compatible. What we're doing on the medical field is not compatible with what is happening in some of the areas on the political scene, but it is compatible with other elements, like exchange of prisoners between us and Hamas, which is now proceeding, and both sides admit that this is happening. So it's a mixed bag at the moment, and we'll have to see how this works itself out. In a couple of days' time, we have a visit here of the American Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. We'll see what he brings in his bag. We'll see how he views this in his talks with the Prime Minister. And by the way, the acting or imminently acting Vice Prime Minister. I think they're not going to call him a Deputy Prime Minister, but a Vice Prime Minister. But not Vice in terms of something faulty, but Vice in terms of his status as against the Prime Minister. I don't know how in a half, 18 months from now, when they're going to change places, whether the incumbent Prime Minister would like to be called Vice Prime Minister. I think that's something to be seen. But at any rate, that's not the subject we're talking on this morning.
I would add that as far as annexation goes, China's stance is very clear, and the question would be for Israel, and Israel tries to promote its relations with China, as we all know. If China says we do not accept this kind of annexation, or it has all kinds of consequences, how that might affect the region. I'll stop here.
I don't think so. The Chinese have been very clear on their position on the Palestinian issue. They have always supported the Palestinian side. They've always made sure that in their relationship with other countries in the region, with emphasis on Saudi Arabia, every time they have discussed the matters of the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, they have emphasized their total support for the Palestinian policies and Palestinian positions, and I think that the Chinese may voice criticism of an annexation. I don't expect any acts on the ground or any effect on the ground concerning the bilateral relations between China and Israel.
Okay. Efraim, in talking with my colleagues Enrico and Ori in the few minutes before this event, Enrico had an interesting observation regarding the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and détente. And Enrico, I wanted to give you a chance maybe to raise that issue to the U.S. and China.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. Well, we can get there. I think it's very interesting what Ambassador said about the differences between like the Cold War, the old Cold War, and what some people label as a new Cold War. I think this is very important because they changed everything. So and to me is also very interesting the fact that the trend that Ambassador share with us when it comes to the Middle East positioning, the regional positioning vis-a-vis this growing competition between China and the US seems being basically a direction of non-alignment. So then I have a question, and I will keep the one, Brandon, if you forgive me, the one of détente later in our discussion, but I think it's quite pertinent at the moment to ask the ambassador whether if there will be space for non-alignment in Israel-China policy. So which kind of direction he foresees for Israel-China relations, and which are the main interests for the Israeli, given the current framework of the international system, to develop relationship with China, both at bilateral and regional level?
Well, first of all, the relationship between Israel and China is a very interesting study, a matter to study, because as you know, they only established relations with us in 1992, and it's now over 25 years, and relations have, on the commercial level, they have increased visibly in terms of the scope of the relationship, the annual billions of dollars, which make the Chinese maybe the second or third partner of Israel in its foreign trade. And I think also there has been a lot of cooperation between Israel and China in various fields. For instance, in agriculture, we for many years were the main training ground for giving academic training in agriculture to the Chinese. We had a special school for that within the agricultural school of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which has the only agricultural school in the entire country. And the Chinese, many of them who were in Israel, in order to be able to end their studies, had to study Hebrew and to be examined in Hebrew, which meant to say that many, many years ago, when the president of the Hebrew University visited China, and he wanted to see all the Chinese who had graduated, all his graduates, hundreds of people came, and they spoke Hebrew, but there was a problem there. The party secretary who was present couldn't understand what was being said, and this created quite a difficult situation there. But that is also, you're smiling, but this was not an easy matter, you know, when the party secretary doesn't know what's going on around him. But at any rate, to come back to what we're talking of, the Chinese have also made very serious inroads into Israeli economy on key issues, issues which are some of them of strategic importance to Israel. They have bought up a fertilizing company called Adama, which is one of the biggest insecticide companies in the world. And they bought the company. And the question arose whether what it would do to us. They bought up the major company, the milk producing company in Israel called Nuva. They paid an exorbitant price. Those who carried out by the way, this transaction on the Chinese side are now in jail because apparently they received quite a lot of illegal payments as a result or during the negotiations. But the Chinese are very present here, and they're also present here in construction. They're not only present in construction of buildings. We have thousands of Chinese building workers here. They're still here, by the way. They didn't go home when the corona broke out, because they can't travel there and back. They have to decide whether to stay here or to go back home. And the majority decided to stay here. But they're also involved in strategic projects in this country. One of them is building the underground railway system, the municipal railway system in Tel Aviv, which is part underground, part overground, and which has a big tunnel which gets within 200 meters of the building of the Israeli military general staff. And you don't have to be a great expert in intelligence to understand what it is to be within 200 meters of the heart of the Israeli Defense Forces. Well, we are told that this matter has been taken care of. I'm a veteran, as Brandon pointed out, in the Israeli intelligence community, and I'm very experienced in issues which have come up as a result of living under the illusion that things have been taken care of. Or many of the problems we have had in our history, our short history of 70-something years, is when we believed we were taking care of something and that something was taking care of us. So we have to be careful on that. We also know that the Chinese are very prominent in port building. And now we have an issue which relates to the building and the servicing of the second Haifa port, which is right next to the berth of Israel's submarine fleet. And this is a matter which the United States has taken up with Israel, and the matter has not yet been determined finally. So we have issues between us and China on these matters. But nobody believes today that we can imagine Israeli economy without the Chinese component, which is also something we have to take into account. If Israel were to disappear tomorrow as a client of China, the Chinese economy would not suffer strategically. If China would suddenly bow out for all the issues and all the projects they're involved in here, this is something which would have a major effect on the economy, and in some respects would be a very detrimental one. But the Chinese have also tried, and this has been stopped, to take over control of Israel's insurance companies. Insurance companies, including companies which control the funds which people receive after retirement funds. If the Chinese were in charge of all the retirement funds in this country, this would be something which could be a stranglehold over the Israeli economy. The insurance companies here are a major player on the financial market, and there are millions and millions of people who are insured for their insurance, have their insurance policies governing their payment after retirement, their retirement pay, and I'm mentioning all this because it shows how, despite the fact that we're trying to keep them at arm's length on many issues, it's not an easy matter. And there are also major business figures in this country, some of the biggest financial tycoons who are also connected with the Israeli political system and who are major supporters of major political parties in Israel, including the major party, which is the government party. And with on one hand or two hands, we can count the number of tycoons of this type, but they are very powerful, and also they have their interest is very, very high. All these are elements which we have to take into account, and we have to be very careful with this. And given the fact that the major partner strategically in the region of China is Iran, and has been there for quite a long time, we have to see how we size up this matter. There was a time when the Prime Minister of Israel championed the construction of a railroad from our southern port Eilat to the Mediterranean. And the Minister of Transport at the time in 2012 traveled to Beijing and signed an MOI about this train. And that project now is dormant, and nobody is trying to push it anymore. I came out publicly on this, and I wrote an article about this for the Nature Society in Israel, who saw this as a threat to Israel's nature in the south, the deserts and all the other aspects of desert life and so forth. But today, nobody's going to push that. But there was a time when the Prime Minister was very enthusiastic about this and was going and waxing almost emotional, talking about trains traveling at 300 kilometers per hour from between Eilat and Ashdod on the Mediterranean. This is no longer a project which is being encouraged and furthered.
The Minister of Transportation was talking about trains going from Israel through Jordan to Saudi Arabia. You know, that's another issue. But I want to ask you, concerning all of those investments and involvement of China or Chinese companies in Israel, one of the things that the Israeli public has been told recently was that the construction of a CFIUS-like mechanism, you know, the Committee on Foreign Investments in the U.S., that Israel is building this kind of mechanism. And there's been all kinds of publications relating to this mechanism in Israel. The question is, how do you see that mechanism, the way it has been proposed here in Israel? And do you think that following the latest, let's say, development between China and the U.S., will the U.S. still accept that form of CFIUS-like mechanism, or do you see the U.S. pushing Israel to make something much more robust out of it?
Well, first of all, we are told from American sources that this issue is going to be raised by the Secretary of State when he visits here. One of the characteristics of this particular subject you mentioned is the clear absence of information which is released to the public. It's difficult to release information on that to the public. This system, which is prevalent in the United States, I think there's also a similar system in Australia, for example, is a process and a procedure whereby discussions take place and decisions are taken. And apart from the decision itself, the reasoning behind it remain behind closed doors, and all the documentation related to it are embargoed and are not for public consummation. It took a long time for Israel to come around to this. I'd like to remind you that when this idea was raised, the government, Mr. Netanyahu, dragged its feet on it for a very, very, very long time. And only after the United States put its foot down, when the then assistant for what's it called? The assistant for strategic affairs, John Bolton. I forget the name exactly of his title, but the presidential assistant in this, who was afterwards resigned, he came to Israel specifically for this issue, and more or less, if I understood between the lines, he presented an American ultimatum to the Prime Minister, which, on behalf of the President, which he had to accept. What the exact content of this, I cannot tell you, for a simple reason: A, that I don't know, and secondly, if I wish to know, I will not be given access to know about this. But as a person who has been very vocal at one time on this issue in the past, and has gone public on this in the past, on one or two of specific issues, I have sensed that they are trying to find a way of achieving the aim without loss of prestige in both directions, to keep it more or less out of the public eye. But I also will say this, that if an issue will come up, a specific issue, which will be in contention between the United States and Israel and China, and Israel will be in the middle of this, except for one case which happened in the past, you will find now that invariably Israel will bow to American demands. There's no question at all about it. And I think that this is something we have to take into account. It's not the policy of the president, the current president of the United States. This has been the policy of several presidents in the White House since the problem came up.
Efraim, you had mentioned a minute ago, and I apologize if I'm changing the subject a bit, that China and Iran had a strategic relationship, and I'd be happy to hear more about that as well. But I wanted to ask more broadly, there's a lot of discussion in the region about the nature of China's role, both in the Middle East, but in other regions as well, the Mediterranean and Europe. Some people characterize it as just business, simply transactional, win-win, to use the cliche. Maybe you could give us your perception on China's strategic interests with respect to our region and perhaps even beyond, and how you see Israel navigating the challenge of China's strategic interests in the region.
Well, first of all, we have to say something about the place of the Middle East in the Chinese perceptions in general. China today considers itself a world power, a global power. The entire globe is under its consideration in various forms. We have it, in the naval field, in the maritime field. We have the famous belt of ports from the South China Sea going throughout the perimeters of the Asian continent, with stops on the way of ports which the Chinese have either built or in some cases after building them, and the ports have reached bankruptcy. They have bought up these ports and owned the ports in some places. In Pakistan, you have one in Sri Lanka. These are considered major ports of interest of China. And this goes on towards the eastern shores of the African continent. And we have Port Sudan, where the Chinese are present. We have Djibouti, which is a former French colony. There, the Chinese have gone one step forward. They have a military outpost there, permanent military post there. And this goes down along the trajectory of Eastern Africa, including up to Mozambique. China is a maritime nation, and China considers itself also to be a potential player inside the Mediterranean. The Chinese are now the major figure in the port of Piraeus in Greece. The Chinese are not in Syria now because the Russians are there and have a port presence there, which they are building, and it's going to be a major port both militarily and for commercial use. But the Chinese certainly envisage the possibility that parts of the Chinese fleet will be visiting the Mediterranean from time to time. The Chinese envisage the sea as one of their major assets and also one of their major interests. And I'd like to mention one other point, and that is at the southern tip of the Latin American continent, you also have a military post there as well. And it's also a post where they have a satellite control into the stratosphere. The Chinese have signaled that Southern America is a place where they have an interest, and they want to exercise their interest as a global power. The second area in which the Chinese are most interested in is oil. Chinese economy cannot maintain itself without massive imports of oil. They import oil from all parts of the world. And in the case of Iran, they're not only buying up Iranian oil, but they are investing heavily in prospecting and in developing new oil fields in Iran, and have signed contracts there, 50-year contracts, and in one case, 100-year contract. And this signifies the Chinese wanting to secure their supply of oil, and B, securing their presence in a place like Iran. Of all the countries in the Middle East, Iran is the one which is closest to China in the commercial field and in terms of the interests that the power has developed inside that country. There is also an element of military interest in Iran. And I will tell you a story which I tell Chinese experts who come here, and they don't believe I'm telling them the truth until they go back and check it. There was a time when the Iranians were involved in the Middle East in the nuclear field, in the nuclear military field. When we set up relations in 1992, 1993, the Prime Minister of Israel, the late Yitzhak Rabin, who later was murdered, 2 years before he was murdered, he paid the first state visit of a prime minister to China in order to raise Israel's concerns about Chinese involvement in the military plans of Iran. And the Chinese counterpart looked him in the eye and told him that there is no such investment, although we knew from impeccable sources that there was such an investment. And that was the reason why the then head of Mossad, Shavit, was accompanying the prime minister and was at his side in order to give further explanations if necessary. But it wasn't necessary because the Chinese simply flatly denied this. Later on, many years ago, a Chinese Air Force general spoke about the Chinese nuclear capabilities and said that these are only there in order to protect China. And there's only one case in which China would even think of reverting to use or some kind of use of their military capability outside, and that would be in case of their big ally, Iran, would be threatened strategically. There is no other case which I had. It was a solitary statement. The man was an Air Force general. He was a senior lecturer in the highest military academy in China. I quoted it in the piece I've written for the Nature Society, but we haven't come back to that. But I'm stating this in terms of how China views its relationship in the Middle East and how China will probably continue to develop its interests. And given the fact, as I said, that as a naval force, they are a naval force, China is interested, very interested, in trying to get a foothold on the area, on the entry to the Persian Gulf. And there also the various small little countries which are on the western side of the Gulf are like the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Bahrain and Kuwait are objects of Chinese interests as they are today.
Good, thank you. I guess, Ori and Rico, if you want to ask some follow-up questions with respect to Israel, my one, I guess, I don't want to dominate the question asking here, Efraim, but I would just say at some point I'd be interested in hearing whether you feel, today Russia is playing this role as sort of the power broker in the region. And I would be interested in knowing whether you saw the Chinese as aspiring to play kind of that role as power projection into the region, but above and beyond the naval issue that you mentioned earlier, more on a political level. But we can get back to that later. Enrico and Ori, if you have questions, please go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I have a related question. Last year, during the visit of President Xi Jinping to Italy, there was a very prominent moment for the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative, because Italy was the first member of the G7 to sign a memorandum of understanding with China on the Belt and Road. So I would like to know what you think about it, whether you think this was a wise choice on the Italian side, and if you can comment on how you foresee the evolution of the Belt and Road Initiative under these new post-COVID circumstances.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand which issue you say?
I'm saying if you can comment what you think about Italy signing the memorandum of understanding with China on the Belt and Road last year, March 2019. What is your opinion about it, and if you can, how you foresee the evolution of the Belt and Road Initiative in this post-COVID international situation?
Well, first of all, let me say that Israel is not part of the Belt and Road. Neither the Belt nor the Road go through Israel. Although there was an attempt at one time on the part of the Chinese to see whether the port of Eilat would join the southern belt, the naval belt, but this was not a serious effort, and this is not on the agenda today. I don't want to comment on the wisdom of the Italian government. I think it's improper on my part. not only because I think I don't understand all that much about it, and I don't know why the Italians did it, but I can imagine that there were all kinds of considerations. I think that we'll have to see how the present crisis affects the continued pursuit of the Chinese on the Belt and Road. They will pursue this because this is really one of the biggest, if not the biggest project they have of asserting themselves on the entire globe. But I think it's going to be slowed down now a little because of COVID and what will happen the next couple of years and so forth. And I don't know what will happen inside China as a result of the COVID affair. One of the things in which we have very little confirmed information, but we have certain indications, say, also public, is that the COVID affair has caused major discomfort inside China amongst the wide population. And there were several events, like the famous event of the eye doctor, who initially spread the rumor about this, and there was summoned to the police station and forced to sign a retraction. And within a month or less than a month, he was contracted the disease, and he died very quickly, I must say. And I'm not hinting at anything. I'm simply stating a fact. And now, by the way, in the way the Chinese have related to this issue in documents of the last week, it is mentioned that the halo of the hero which they gave him in order to counteract what happened at the initial stage of dealing with him, this has also taken on a different aura. And I invite you to see and follow this particular event, how the Chinese are going to present this particular incident in Wuhan of the eye doctor 6 months from now, 1 year from now. It'll be interesting. So we don't have real information as the effects of the Wuhan event at the moment. We speak of Wuhan. I'd like to remind you, Wuhan is a city of over 12 million people. It's a city which is a showcase city of China today. It's a city where the Chinese have invested heavily in academic institutions, in industry, in high tech, and everything. And the people in Wuhan are people. Most of them are middle class and high class Chinese. I'm saying high class not in terms of their wealth, but in terms of their status and stature. Wuhan has been the object of pride of the Chinese per se, for the way Wuhan has developed over the years. So we don't know yet how this is going to affect the system of government in China. We don't know how this is going to affect the term of office of the current leader of China, to put it mildly. These things have a character of having ripple effects over quite some time. One of the results of COVID is, of course, that suddenly both President Putin and the President Xi find themselves in a very difficult situation domestically. And it's not easy for them. Sitting on the advantages of being in the academic world, you have the luxury of watching this development of the two major players here, and how each of them is treating the present crisis, and what each is trying to maneuver and extract from the crisis, and how they can defend themselves on the crisis. All this is part of this larger picture. But it's fascinating, I think, in many respects, and I find it fascinating every day to read the press and to read a lot of information on this, which is appearing, and I think it reflects the potential of many unexpected and unplanned turns of events.
Speaking
We have
about
a few minutes to go, so how would you want to use them up?
I'll have perhaps a quick question that follows up on what you were saying about the internal issues within China. And I think it falls back to the beginning of our conversation when we were talking about the broad perspective and the original Cold War, which gives us, and especially you, this kind of perspective on how different regimes have evolved during the, let's say, 70s, 80s, and so on. And my question goes back to the China-US issues, since it seems that in the past, I think that in the past 3 years, but certainly in the past few months, we've seen a lot of attacks from the US on the Chinese Communist Party, trying to isolate the Chinese Communist Party from China, trying to say we're not the rivals of China, but we have a beef with the Chinese Communist Party, and trying to make the Chinese public, in a way, go against the party. What is your perspective on this? How do you see it, again, in a long-term kind of the ways that events have turned out in the past? Does this kind of an approach have the potential to actually work in the long run?
I don't think it has a potential of working in the long run, because ultimately it's the people of China who will decide on their form of government. And I say the people because there have been times in which the people have tried to change what has happened. You have the event of Tiananmen Square, which, if you look at it in a larger perspective, did have an effect on the way China treated its own citizens shortly after that. And there's no doubt about it that the people who sacrificed their life there ultimately did achieve something. Maybe they didn't achieve everything they wished, but they did achieve something. But we have other things in China. China is a continent, after all, in itself, almost. Although it's all in one continent, but it's the size of China is probably the largest country in the world. I'm not sure. It's lesser than the Russia, I think, more or less. But at any rate, I think that we have to, and this is much longer talk than we can do in the minutes we have. We are seeing major cracks in the system of liberal democracy as well at the same time. It's not as if something is happening in China, something is happening in Russia. Something is happening in liberal democracy. And we're seeing what is happening in Eastern Europe. We're seeing what's happening in Hungary and what is happening in Poland. We're seeing the rise again of a very extremist party in Germany. We're seeing the fact that in the United States, the political system with a two-party system, the way it's been, is under very, very great strains. There are people who think that the liberal democracy is reaching the last 50 years of its lifetime. There was a play recently in London called Imperium, which was written by a man called Robert Harris. It's a 7-hour play in 2 parts, and it is all centered around Cicero, who was a famous figure in Rome. And the first part of the play is the rise of Cicero, and the second part of the play is the fall of Cicero. And the person who wrote this play, Robert Harris, who's a very well-known writer in Britain and is internationally respected, believes that we are now in the last 50 years of liberal democracy. What can replace liberal democracy, I don't know. I have no offer. I have no idea. But it's very clear that liberal democracy has had its weaknesses. And whereas for a long time it was a bulwark of strength and of freedom and the freedom of human rights and citizen rights and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, if you like, the American dictum on this. But ultimately, the question arises, is there an alternative to this, which is something different and not a dictatorship? It's a big question mark. I don't want to mislead you, because I don't expect to be around when this happens, but you might be around. It'll be interesting for you, or some of you here. But I think that, yes, China is already going through a very, very deep process of something. And the way they are reacting and the way they are fighting for their position in the world and the way they are not cooperating in coming clean, as we say, and being transparent on this issue is ultimately making it more difficult for them, also internally.
Okay, Efraim, I don't want to keep you much longer, because I know we had set a time limit in advance. I wanted to take the opportunity on behalf of the TAU MDC ChinaMed collaboration to again thank you for your time. It's been fascinating as always, and we really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. For me, it's been a challenge, and I enjoyed it very much. And I hope this has been of some use to you, all of you. And I wish you well. And if at any time in the future you want to repeat it, one thing or another, but don't do it too often. But nevertheless, and I wish you all well. And let's hope for a year of recuperation from the COVID-19, although we're not there yet. So let's end it on a note of hope and of belief and trust in the ultimate goodwill of mankind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.